Have you ever been so desperate that your pride became a luxury you simply could not afford? Today, I am going to tell you the incredible story of Naomi Carter, a 28-year-old woman who thought she had hit rock bottom when she lost her job, her apartment, and her last dollar all in the same week. But rock bottom, she would discover, was just the beginning of a journey that would lead her to the most unexpected place imaginable, the private office of Dante Moretti, one of the most feared Italian mafia bosses on the East Coast. What happened when Dante looked out his window and saw a beautiful black woman digging through his restaurant's dumpster would set off a chain of events involving danger, protection, passion, and a love story that proves sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely sources. So settle in, because this story will make you believe that fate has a sense of humor, and that sometimes the darkest moments lead to the most extraordinary destinies. Naomi Carter had always believed in the power of hard work. Growing up in a small apartment in the Bronx with her grandmother, she had learned early that nothing in life came free and that dignity was something you earned through perseverance and determination. She had worked her way through community college, earned a degree in business administration, and landed what she thought was her dream job as an administrative assistant at a prestigious marketing firm in Midtown Manhattan. For 3 years, Naomi had been the model employee. She arrived early, stayed late, anticipated her boss's needs before he even knew he had them, and never once complained about the extra work that always seemed to land on her desk. She had saved diligently, building a small nest egg that she hoped would someday become a down payment on an apartment of her own. She had plans, goals, a future mapped out in careful, responsible steps. Then everything fell apart. It started with the company restructuring. Corporate decided that administrative assistants were an unnecessary expense in the age of digital calendars and automated scheduling. Naomi was called into human resources on a Tuesday afternoon and handed a severance package that amounted to exactly 6 weeks of pay. "Thank you for your service. Best of luck in your future endeavors. Please clean out your desk by 5. Naomi had walked out of that building in a daze, her small box of personal belongings clutched to her chest, trying to remember how to breathe. It was fine, she told herself. She had savings. She would find another job. This was New York City. There were always opportunities for someone willing to work hard, but the job market had other ideas. Week after week, Naomi sent out resumes, attended interviews, and waited by her phone for calls that never came. The position she was qualified for went to candidates with more experience. The entry-level jobs told her she was overqualified. The temp agencies put her on lists and promised to call when something came up. Meanwhile, the bills kept coming. First, she burned through her severance. Then she started dipping into her savings. The nest egg she had spent years building disappeared in a matter of months, eaten up by rent and utilities and the basic necessities of survival. She sold her television, then her nice clothes, then the jewelry her grandmother had left her. Each sale felt like losing a piece of herself. But what choice did she have? The eviction notice came on a gray Thursday morning in early November. Naomi had been behind on rent for 2 months, and her landlord, a man who had always seemed so friendly when she paid on time, informed her through his lawyer that she had 72 hours to vacate the premises. 72 hours to pack up her entire life and figure out where she was going to go. Naomi had no family left in the city. Her grandmother had passed away 4 years ago, and her mother had disappeared into addiction when Naomi was still a child. She had friends, sort of, but they were the kind of friends you grab drinks with after work, not the kind you could call and ask to sleep on their couch indefinitely. Pride, that stubborn companion that had gotten her through so much, made it impossible to reach out and admit how far she had fallen. So Naomi packed what she could carry into a single suitcase and walked out of her apartment for the last time, leaving behind the furniture she couldn't sell and the dreams she couldn't afford. The first night, she slept in a 24-hour laundromat, sitting upright in a plastic chair and pretending to wait for clothes that weren't there. The second night, she found a women's shelter, but it was full, and they could only offer her a meal and a list of other resources to try. The third night, she wandered the streets until exhaustion drove her into the subway system, where she rode the trains until morning, too afraid to close her eyes. By the end of her first week on the streets, Naomi understood things she had never wanted to know. She understood that hunger was not just an empty stomach, but a constant gnawing companion that made it hard to think about anything else. She understood that being invisible was both a blessing and a curse. People looked right through her, which meant they didn't offer help, but they also didn't offer harm. She understood that her previous life, the one where she worried about things like career advancement and retirement savings, had been a privilege she had never fully appreciated. And she understood that pride, when you were hungry enough, stopped mattering. That was how Naomi found herself behind La Stella Nera on a bitter November evening, her hands shaking from cold as she lifted the lid of the dumpster and prayed she would find something edible. La Stella Nera was not the kind of restaurant Naomi had ever expected to be stealing from. It was legendary in Manhattan, a place where reservations were booked months in advance, and a single meal could cost more than Naomi used to make in a week. The building itself was gorgeous, a converted warehouse in Tribeca with exposed brick, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a discreet entrance that attracted celebrities, politicians, and people whose names appeared in the business section of the Times. Naomi had chosen it precisely because of its reputation. A restaurant that served $500 tasting menus probably threw away better food than most places served. At least that was her desperate reasoning as she crept down the alley behind the building, her worn sneakers silent on the wet pavement. The dumpster was enormous, industrial-sized, positioned next to a loading dock that was mercifully empty at this hour. Naomi glanced around, making sure she was alone, then heaved the heavy lid up and propped it against the wall. The smell hit her first, not the rotting garbage smell she had feared, but something else, something that made her empty stomach clench with longing. She could detect garlic and tomatoes and herbs, the rich aroma of Italian cooking that seemed almost cruel in its deliciousness. Naomi reached in, pushing aside bags of actual trash until she found what she was looking for, containers of food that looked barely touched. A tray of what appeared to be roasted vegetables. A container of pasta that someone had apparently decided they didn't want after taking only a few bites. A whole basket of bread that was probably too stale for the restaurant's exacting standards, but would taste like heaven to someone who hadn't eaten in 2 days. She was so focused on her treasure hunt that she didn't notice the light come on in the window above her. Didn't notice the figure standing there, watching her with an intensity that would have made her blood run cold if she had seen it. Dante Moretti had been working late, as he often did. La Stella Nera was more than a restaurant to him. It was a legacy, a legitimate business that he had built from the ground up to prove that he was more than the darkness of his family's history. His office occupied the entire 3rd floor of the building, a space that allowed him to oversee his empire, both the legal one that served exquisite Italian cuisine and the other one that operated in the shadows of the city. He had been reviewing financial reports when movement in the alley caught his eye. The security cameras would have picked it up regardless, but Dante preferred to see things for himself. He moved to the window and looked down. At first, he thought it was one of the usual homeless people who sometimes wandered through the area. The city was full of them, casualties of a system that chewed people up and spit them out without a second thought. Dante was not heartless about it. He had standing orders that anyone found sleeping near his establishment should be given a meal and directed to shelters. But he had learned long ago that he could not save everyone. Then the figure shifted, and the security light caught her face, and Dante Moretti felt something he had not experienced in a very long time. She was beautiful. Not in the polished, artificial way of the women who frequented his restaurant and his bed, but in a way that seemed almost painful to witness. Her skin was dark and smooth, her features elegant even in their distress. Her hair was pulled back in a simple style, and even from this distance Dante could see that she had been pretty once, before whatever circumstances had brought her to his dumpster had stripped the shine from her eyes. But it was not her beauty that made Dante pause. It was something else. Something in the way she moved, the careful dignity she maintained even as she picked through garbage. She was not grabbing frantically or stuffing things in her pockets. She was selecting, choosing, maintaining some invisible standard even in her desperation. This was someone who had not always been here, Dante realized. This was someone who had fallen. He watched as she pulled out a container of pasta, Giovanni's famous cacio e pepe, if Dante wasn't mistaken, and examined it with an expression that broke something open in his chest. She looked at that pasta the way his mother used to look at pictures of the Italian countryside she had left behind, like it represented something lost, something precious. Dante reached for his phone and called down to security. Marco answered on the first ring. "Boss? There is a woman in the alley, by the dumpster. I see her on camera. Want me to run her off?" Dante was silent for a moment, watching as the woman carefully closed the dumpster lid and gathered her findings. She was trying to be neat about it, he noticed, trying not to make a mess, trying to maintain dignity even when dignity was the last thing she could afford. "No," Dante said finally. "Bring her to me. Boss. You heard me. Bring her inside. Be gentle about it. Offer her a coat if she needs one. And Marco, do not frighten her." Marco, who had worked for Dante for 15 years and thought he had seen everything, was silent for a long moment. "Understood, boss." Dante hung up and turned back to the window. The woman had disappeared from view, which meant she was probably heading toward the street. Marco would intercept her before she got far. He did not know why he was doing this. It was not like him to involve himself in the personal dramas of strangers, especially strangers who had nothing to offer him in return. The Moretti family had not built their empire through random acts of charity. Every action had a purpose, a strategy, a calculation behind it. But something about this woman made calculation feel inadequate. Something about seeing her try to maintain her dignity in the face of such obvious desperation had touched a part of Dante he had thought long dead. He wanted to know her story, and Dante Moretti was a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted. Naomi had just reached the mouth of the alley when two men stepped out of the shadows. Her heart stopped. This was it, she thought. This was how her story ended. She had survived eviction and homelessness and hunger, only to be mugged, or worse, in an alley behind some fancy restaurant. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head. Keep your head down and keep moving. Don't make eye contact. Don't give them a reason. But the men did not look like muggers. They were wearing suits, expensive suits that fit too well to have come off any rack, and they held themselves with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested they had nothing to prove to anyone. Miss, the taller one said, his voice surprisingly gentle, please don't be alarmed. My employer would like to speak with you. Naomi clutched her bag of stolen food to her chest. Your employer? Mr. Moretti. He owns this establishment. He saw you from his window and asked me to bring you inside. Fear spiked through Naomi's veins. She was being arrested. Of course she was being arrested. Stealing was stealing, even if what she stole was garbage. She would go to jail, and that would be the final nail in the coffin of her former life. I am sorry, she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I haven't eaten in a while, and I thought, I'll put it back. All of it. I'm sorry. The man, Marco, though Naomi didn't know his name yet, held up a hand. You're not in trouble. Mr. Moretti simply wants to talk. He asked me to tell you that you're welcome to keep what you found. He also asked me to offer you this. He held out a coat. A beautiful cashmere coat that probably cost more than 3 months of Naomi's old rent. It was cold in the alley, cold enough that Naomi's teeth had been chattering for the last hour, but she didn't reach for it. I don't understand, she said. Neither do I, Marco admitted with something that might have been a smile, but Mr. Moretti gave an order and I follow orders. Please, miss. It's warm inside. There's food. Real food, not garbage. Whatever your situation is, I promise you it will be better after a hot meal. Naomi wanted to refuse. Every survival instinct she had developed over the past week screamed that this was a trap, that men did not pull beautiful women out of alleys and offer them coats and hot meals without expecting something in return. The world did not work that way. She had learned that lesson thoroughly, but she was so cold and so hungry. And something in Marco's eyes, something unexpectedly kind, made her want to believe just for a moment that maybe the world wasn't entirely cruel. Okay, she whispered. Okay. Marco nodded and held the coat out again. This time, Naomi took it. The inside of La Stella Nera was even more beautiful than Naomi had imagined. She had walked past restaurants like this her whole life, peering through windows at the elegant diners and white tablecloths, and sparkling chandeliers, never imagining that she would ever be one of the people inside. Now, wearing a coat that smelled like expensive cologne, and following two men in suits through a kitchen that gleamed with professional-grade equipment, she felt like she had stepped into an alternate universe. The staff they passed didn't stare exactly, but Naomi could feel their curiosity like a physical weight. They led her to an elevator, a private elevator tucked away behind a door that most customers probably never even noticed, and rode up in silence. When the doors opened, Naomi found herself in a space that was part office, part apartment, and entirely overwhelming. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the Manhattan skyline. The furniture was leather and dark wood, masculine but elegant. There was a sitting area with sofas that looked more comfortable than any bed Naomi had slept in lately, and a bar stocked with bottles whose labels she didn't recognize but suspected cost more than her old monthly salary. And standing by the window, silhouetted against the city lights, was a man. He turned when they entered, and Naomi's breath caught in her throat. He was tall, over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his perfectly tailored suit. His hair was dark, almost black, swept back from a face that could have graced magazine covers. But it was his eyes that captured her. They were dark too, dark and intense and focused on her with an attention that made her feel seen in a way she had not felt seen in months. This was not a man you disobeyed, Naomi realized. This was not a man you lied to or played games with. This was a man who commanded respect simply by existing. "Thank you, Marco," the man said, and even his voice was compelling, deep and smooth with a hint of an accent that Naomi couldn't quite place. Italian, she thought. That would make sense. That will be all. Marco nodded and retreated, the elevator doors closing behind him with a soft chime. Naomi was alone with this stranger in his beautiful office, wearing his expensive coat and clutching a bag of food she had stolen from his garbage. "Please," the man said, gesturing toward the sitting area, "make yourself comfortable. You must be cold." "Who are you?" Naomi asked, because she had learned that sometimes offense was the best defense, and standing here in silence felt too much like submission. Something that might have been approval flickered in those dark eyes. "My name is Dante Moretti. This is my restaurant. And my building. And, I am told, my dumpster from which you were harvesting your dinner." Shame flooded Naomi's cheeks with heat. "I said I was sorry. I'll pay you back when I can." "Just please don't call the police." Dante moved toward her, not quickly enough to be threatening, but with a purpose that made her want to step back. She held her ground through sheer force of will. "I have no intention of calling the police," he said, "and I have no interest in your apology or your repayment. What I am interested in is how a woman who carries herself like you do ended up eating from a dumpster." Naomi blinked. "Carries myself?" "You have presence," Dante said simply. "Even when you were picking through garbage, you moved like someone who mattered. I want to know how someone like you ended up here." It was the strangest compliment Naomi had ever received, and she wasn't sure it was a compliment at all. But something about the way he said it, matter-of-factly, as if he were simply stating an observation, made her want to answer him honestly. "I lost my job," she said. "Then I lost my apartment. Then I lost everything else. It happens faster than you would think, going from normal to this. One day you're worrying about whether you can afford a vacation next summer, and then suddenly you're worrying about where you're going to sleep tonight. The world doesn't care about your plans. It just keeps moving whether you can keep up or not." Dante studied her for a long moment. Then he walked to the bar and poured 2 glasses of something amber and expensive-looking. "How long since you've eaten?" he asked, offering her one of the glasses. 2 days, maybe 3. I lose track." Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Put down that bag and come with me." He led her through a door she hadn't noticed, into a private dining room that was clearly designed for important meetings. A long table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs, but Dante guided her to a smaller table by the window, set intimately for 2. He picked up a phone, spoke rapid Italian into it, and hung up. Then he sat down across from her and waited. Food arrived within minutes. Not fancy food, not the kind of architectural presentations Naomi had imagined La Stella Nera serving, but real food. Pasta with rich red sauce and chunks of sausage. Fresh bread with butter that glistened. A salad with vegetables that looked like they had been picked that morning. And soup. Chicken soup with noodles and vegetables. That smelled like comfort itself. "Eat," Dante said. "We can talk after." Naomi wanted to protest. She wanted to maintain some dignity, to not fall on the food like an animal. But her body had other ideas. Her hands were shaking as she picked up a spoon, and the first bite of soup was so good that tears sprang to her eyes without warning. She ate. She tried to pace herself, tried to remember the manners her grandmother had drilled into her, but her stomach was a demanding master and the food was right there, and Dante was not watching her with judgment, but with something that looked almost like satisfaction. When she finally slowed down, her body registering fullness for the first time in what felt like forever, she looked up to find him studying her again with those unreadable eyes. "Better?" he asked. "Yes. Thank you. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for this." Dante waved a hand dismissively. "One meal is nothing. What I want to know is what you're going to do tomorrow, and the day after that. Do you have any plan beyond surviving the night?" The question should have felt intrusive. Instead, it felt like the first honest conversation Naomi had had in months. Everyone else either pretended not to see her or offered platitudes about things getting better, about keeping her chin up, about opportunities around the corner. No one actually asked what she was going to do about her situation. "I've been looking for work," she said. "Any work. But it's hard when you don't have an address or a phone or clean clothes for interviews. It's a catch-22. You need a job to afford those things, but you need those things to get a job. What did you do before? I was an administrative assistant at a marketing firm. I was good at it, actually. I kept everything running smoothly, anticipated problems before they happened, made sure the executives had everything they needed. Then they decided they didn't need me anymore. Dante nodded slowly, as if filing this information away. And you have no one? No family, no friends who could help? My grandmother raised me, but she passed away. And I have friends, sort of, but... Naomi hesitated, struggling to explain something that felt both obvious and shameful. Asking for help is hard. Admitting that you failed is hard. I kept thinking I would figure it out on my own, that I just needed one break, one opportunity, and things would turn around, but they didn't. And by the time I realized how bad things had gotten, I was too embarrassed to reach out. Pride is expensive, it turns out. Dante's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Something that looked almost like recognition. Pride, he said quietly, can be the most expensive thing we own. They sat in silence for a moment, and Naomi had the strange sense that this man, this powerful, intimidating stranger, understood something about her that she had never put into words. The cost of pride, the weight of falling, the way the world looked different once you had seen it from the bottom. I have a proposal, Dante said finally. Naomi's guard went back up immediately. She had learned in her weeks on the street that proposals from men usually came with strings attached. Strings that led to places she had no intention of going. Dante seemed to read her thoughts. It is not that kind of proposal, he said, with a hint of something that might have been amusement. I am not in the habit of taking advantage of vulnerable women. I have a reputation to consider. More importantly, I have a mother who would rise from her grave to kill me herself if I ever treated a woman with disrespect. Despite herself, Naomi felt the corner of her mouth twitch. Then what kind of proposal is it? I need an assistant, a good one. Someone who can keep my legitimate business affairs organized, coordinate with my staff, and manage the 1,000 details that I do not have time to handle myself. My previous assistant left 3 months ago. She got married and moved to California, and the temporary replacements have been inadequate. Dante leaned back in his chair. You said you were good at your job. Prove it. Work for me. Naomi stared at him. You're offering me a job? Just like that? You don't know anything about me. I could be anyone. I could be terrible. I know that you maintained your dignity in circumstances that would have broken many people. I know that you were choosing carefully even when you were taking from a dumpster, which tells me you have standards. And I know that you did not lie to me even when lying might have served your interests. Those are qualities I value. But I was stealing from you. An hour ago, I was literally picking through your garbage. And now you are sitting in my private dining room having a conversation with me. Circumstances change. What matters is what you do when they do. Naomi's mind was racing. This had to be a trap. Things like this did not happen in the real world. Powerful men did not pull women out of alleys and offer them jobs and hot meals and coats without expecting something in return. What's the catch? She asked bluntly. Dante's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something vulnerable beneath the polished surface. The catch, he said, is that my world is not a safe one. I run legitimate businesses, yes. This restaurant, real estate, import and export. But my family has a history that I cannot escape, and that history comes with enemies. You would not be in danger directly, I would not allow that. But you would be entering a world where not everything is as simple as it appears. Naomi processed this. You're telling me you're involved in something illegal. I am telling you that my family is involved in things that exist outside the law. I have tried to move away from that legacy, to build something clean, but blood is blood. And in my world, reputation matters more than reality. People assume things about me that may or may not be true. Working for me would mean being associated with those assumptions. So you're Mafia. Dante's expression flickered. Annoyance, maybe, or resignation. That is a word for it. I prefer to think of myself as a businessman with complicated relatives. But yes, my father was Don Moretti. I am his son. That will never change, no matter how many restaurants I open or how many taxes I pay. Naomi should have been terrified. She should have thanked him for dinner and walked out and never looked back. Instead, she found herself thinking about what her grandmother used to say. Beggars can't be choosers, baby. You take the hand that's reaching out to you and you make the best of it. Was this hand reaching out to her, or was it pulling her under? What exactly would this job entail? She heard herself asking. Administrative work, scheduling, correspondence, managing my calendar. You would have an office here in the building, a salary that I think you will find generous, and access to resources that will allow you to rebuild your life. In return, I expect discretion, loyalty, and competence. And if I say no, then Marco will drive you to whichever shelter you prefer, and I will wish you well. I am not holding you prisoner, Miss Carter. Naomi Carter. Miss Carter. The choice is yours. Naomi thought about the shelter beds that were never available, the temp agencies that never called, the interviews where she showed up looking shabby and desperate, and watched the hiring manager's face close against her before she even sat down. She thought about her grandmother, who had worked 3 jobs to keep them fed and housed, and who had always told Naomi that God helped those who helped themselves. And she thought about this man, Dante Moretti, who looked at her like she was someone worth salvaging when the rest of the world had looked right through her. "When do I start?" she asked. Dante's smile was slow and satisfied. "Tomorrow," he said, "but tonight you will sleep in one of my guest rooms. You are in no condition to navigate the streets, and I have plenty of space. In the morning we will discuss terms and begin getting you settled." "Just like that?" "Just like that." Naomi shook her head slowly, feeling like she was dreaming. "Why are you doing this?" "Really?" "I don't believe for a second that you make a habit of rescuing women from dumpsters." Dante was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was softer than she had heard it before. "My mother," he said. "When she first came to this country she had nothing. She was young and scared and alone, and she made choices that were not always wise because survival demanded it. Someone helped her once, a stranger who had no reason to care but did anyway. She told me that story every year on the anniversary of her arrival. She said that kindness from strangers was the most holy thing in the world, and that anyone who had the power to help and chose not to use it was answering to God for their cowardice." He paused, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I saw you through that window, and I saw someone who reminded me of her, someone who was trying to survive with dignity in a world that offers very little of either. I do not know if I believe in God, Miss Carter, but I believe in honoring my mother's memory, and I believe that you deserve a chance to be more than the circumstances that brought you here." Naomi felt tears prick at her eyes again, but these were different from the tears that had come with the soup. These were the tears of being seen, of being recognized as human when she had started to feel like a ghost. "Thank you," she whispered. It felt inadequate, but it was all she had. "Don't thank me yet," Dante said, and there was a hint of something like warmth in his voice. "You haven't seen what my schedule looks like. You may regret accepting by the end of your first week." Despite everything, Naomi laughed. It was a rusty sound, unfamiliar after so many weeks of having nothing to laugh about, but it was real. "I'll take my chances," she said. Dante stood and offered her his hand. "Then, welcome to La Stella Nera, Miss Carter. I have a feeling you're going to fit in perfectly." The guest room was nicer than any hotel room Naomi had ever stayed in, which wasn't saying much, but it was also nicer than any hotel room she had ever seen pictures of. The bed was enormous, piled with pillows and covered in sheets that felt like clouds. The bathroom had a soaking tub and a shower with multiple heads and more products than Naomi could identify. She stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, clutching the bag of food she had stolen. Dante had insisted she keep it, some kind of ironic souvenir of how they'd met, and trying to convince herself this was real. Tomorrow she might wake up and discover it had all been a dream. Tomorrow she might find out there was a catch she hadn't seen coming. Tomorrow any number of things might go wrong. But tonight she was warm. She was full. And she had hope, which was something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Naomi Carter showered with hot water that didn't run out, wrapped herself in a robe that was softer than anything she'd ever owned, and climbed into that enormous bed. She was asleep within minutes. The next morning dawned gray and cold, but inside Dante's building everything was warm and bright. Naomi woke slowly, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, then remembered where she was and felt that surge of hope again. She found clothes laid out for her, simple but high quality, black pants and a white blouse that fit perfectly, which meant someone had estimated her size while she was sleeping, which was slightly creepy but mostly just efficient. There was a note on top of the stack. "Breakfast is served in the private dining room. Take your time. DM." Naomi dressed carefully, then spent longer than she would have liked studying herself in the mirror. She looked different already. Amazing what a hot meal and a real night's sleep could do. The shadows under her eyes were still there, but they weren't as deep. Her skin had lost some of the grayish tinge that had alarmed her the few times she'd caught her reflection lately. She looked like someone who might be employable. She looked like herself again. Dante was waiting for her in the dining room, a newspaper spread before him and a cup of espresso at his elbow. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, just for a moment, before settling back into that controlled neutrality. "Good morning, Miss Carter. I trust you slept well. Better than I have in weeks." "Thank you again." "Please," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Eat. We have much to discuss." Breakfast was as excellent as dinner had been. Fresh fruit, perfectly scrambled eggs, toast with butter and jam, and a coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. Naomi tried to eat with more composure than she'd managed the night before, but it was hard when everything tasted so good. As she ate, Dante outlined what he expected from her. His schedule was complex, he explained, divided between the restaurant, his real estate holdings, and various charitable foundations his mother had established before her death. He needed someone who could keep track of all the moving pieces, anticipate conflicts, and handle correspondence with discretion and professionalism. The salary he named made Naomi choke on her coffee. "Is that acceptable?" Dante asked, with what she was starting to recognize as his version of humor. "That's more than I made at my last job. Significantly more. You'll be doing significantly more. I also expect absolute discretion, as I mentioned. What you see and hear in this building stays in this building. That is non-negotiable." "Understood. Good." He pushed a folder across the table. "This contains your employment contract, as well as information about the benefits package. Health insurance, retirement savings, and a housing allowance. Until you find your own place, you are welcome to continue using the guest suite." Naomi stared at the folder like it might bite her. "A housing allowance? New York is expensive. I need my assistant functional, not stressed about rent. It is a practical consideration, nothing more." "Right. Practical. I am a very practical man, Miss Carter. You will find that everything I do has a purpose." Over the next few weeks, Naomi discovered just how true that was. Dante Moretti did nothing without intention. Every meeting, every phone call, every decision was calculated for maximum effect. He was ruthless in his efficiency and demanding in his expectations, but he was also fair. He acknowledged good work. He listened when Naomi had suggestions. He treated her with a respect that she had rarely experienced in professional settings, and slowly, carefully, she began to learn about the world she had entered. The restaurant, La Stella Nera, was the jewel of Dante's legitimate empire. It had 3 Michelin stars and a waiting list that stretched months into the future. The staff were fiercely loyal, and Naomi quickly learned that many of them had stories similar to hers, people Dante had found at their lowest points and offered opportunities to. Giovanni, the head chef, had been a recovering addict whom Dante had pulled out of a halfway house. Rosa, the front-of-house manager, was a former domestic violence survivor whose ex-husband had tried to kill her. Dante had dealt with the ex in ways that Rosa never discussed but clearly appreciated. Even Marco, who Naomi had learned was Dante's head of security, had a history, something about a wrongful conviction and a decade lost to the prison system before Dante's family had gotten involved. They were loyal to him, all of them, with a fierce protectiveness that went beyond normal employer-employee relationships. They were family. And slowly, Naomi began to feel like she might be welcomed into that family too. The less legitimate aspects of Dante's world remained mostly hidden from her. She knew they existed, the unexplained visitors who came and went through private entrances, the phone calls conducted in Italian with voices raised, the occasional tension in Dante's jaw that suggested something had gone wrong somewhere in his complicated web of interests. But he kept her insulated from it, and she found that she was grateful for the buffer. What surprised her most was how much she liked the work itself. After years of being underestimated and overworked at the marketing firm, being given real responsibility felt like a revelation. She reorganized Dante's filing system, streamlined his scheduling process, and even began handling some of his correspondence directly after he discovered she had a talent for diplomatic language. "You are wasted as an assistant," he told her one evening, about a month after she started. "Have you ever considered that you might be capable of more?" Naomi looked up from the calendar she was updating. More? Running something, building something. "You have instincts, Miss Carter, good ones. With the right opportunity." He trailed off and something passed between them. something that had been building since that first night, when he'd looked at her with those intense dark eyes and made her feel like she mattered. "I'm just trying to get back on my feet," she said carefully. "One step at a time." "Of course." Dante's expression shuddered, and when he spoke again, his voice was professionally brisk. "The Castellano meeting has been moved to Thursday. Make sure the private dining room is prepared." "Yes, Mr. Moretti." It should have been a relief, the way he retreated back into formality. It should have made things simpler. Instead, Naomi found herself lying awake that night, thinking about the way his eyes had softened when he'd talked about her potential. She was in dangerous territory, and she knew it. The shift happened gradually, then all at once. But before that shift, there were weeks of learning. Weeks of watching Dante operate in his complicated world and slowly understanding the man behind the reputation. Naomi learned that he woke every morning at 5, no matter how late he had stayed up the night before. She learned that he spoke 4 languages fluently and was teaching himself a 5th, Mandarin, because he believed the future of business lay in international connections. She learned that he read voraciously, consuming everything from philosophy to thriller novels to scientific journals, and that his office contained a hidden library that he was almost shy about showing her. "I read to quiet my mind," he explained one evening when she found him there, surrounded by books and looking almost vulnerable in his solitude. "In my world, there is always noise, always demands, always people who want something from me. Books are the only place where I get to be silent." "What are you reading now?" Naomi had asked, genuinely curious. "Marcus Aurelius." "The Meditations?" He smiled faintly. "A Roman emperor writing about how to be a good person in a world full of chaos. It seems relevant." She learned about his family, too, in bits and pieces that he revealed like gifts. His mother, Teresa, who had died 5 years ago from cancer, and whose memory still brought tears to his eyes. His father, the notorious Don Moretti, who had ruled the family empire with an iron fist until a heart attack took him in his sleep. His younger brother, Alessandro, who had rejected the family business entirely and now lived in California working as a veterinarian, a choice Dante respected even though it meant they rarely saw each other. "He calls me once a month," Dante said. "We talk about his practice, his patients, his life. He never asks about my business. I never volunteer. It is healthier that way." "Do you miss him?" "Every day. But I love him enough to let him have the distance he needs. Some people are not built for this life. Alessandro is one of them. I envy him sometimes, honestly. The simplicity of his choices." Naomi learned that beneath the polished exterior and the dangerous reputation, Dante Moretti was lonely. Profoundly, achingly lonely. He had surrounded himself with people, employees, associates, guards, but real connection was rare. Trust was rarer still. In his world, everyone wanted something, and genuine relationships were nearly impossible to maintain. "You are different," he told her once, late at night when they were both working in his office and the city lights sparkled below them. "You came to me with nothing to offer and nothing to gain. You did not know who I was or what I could give you. You were just honest, in your desperation, in your dignity, in everything." I had forgotten what that looked like. Naomi also learned about the business, not the shadow business that operated in the margins, but the legitimate empire he was trying to build. He was passionate about the restaurant, about the quality of every dish and the experience of every guest. He was equally passionate about his real estate holdings, which he was systematically developing into affordable housing in neighborhoods that desperately needed it. "My father built his wealth on people's desperation," he explained. "I want to build mine by alleviating it. It is not redemption. Nothing could redeem some of what my family has done, but it is something. It is a direction." She learned that he had been engaged once, years ago, to a woman from another powerful family, an arranged match that was supposed to solidify alliances and produce heirs. He had ended it 6 months before the wedding, causing a scandal that had nearly started a war. "I could not do it," he said when Naomi finally worked up the courage to ask. "I looked at her and felt nothing. Respect, yes, even affection. But not love. Not the kind of love I had watched my parents share. My mother married my father knowing exactly what he was, and she loved him anyway. She used to say that real love was not blind. It saw everything and chose to stay anyway. I wanted that. I refused to settle for less." "And did you find it?" Naomi asked, her heart pounding. Dante had looked at her with those dark, intense eyes. "I thought I never would. until recently. The tension between them grew with every passing day. It was in the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she was not looking, in the way her breath caught when their hands accidentally touched, in the long silences that were not awkward but charged with something unspoken. Rosa noticed. Of course Rosa noticed. She noticed everything. "He is different with you," she told Naomi one afternoon as they reviewed the seating arrangements for an upcoming event. "I have worked for Mr. Moretti for 7 years. I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. How does he look at me? Like you are the answer to a question he has been asking his whole life." Naomi tried to dismiss it, tried to tell herself that she was imagining things, that Dante was simply being kind to someone he had rescued, that she was projecting her own growing feelings onto him, but she was not imagining the way he found excuses to be near her. She was not imagining the private dinners that had become a regular occurrence. She was not imagining the vulnerability he showed her, the secrets he shared, the way he seemed to relax in her presence in a way he never did with anyone else. And she was not imagining her own feelings, which had grown from gratitude to respect to something much more dangerous. She was falling in love with Dante Moretti, falling hard and fast and completely. It started with small things. Dante bringing her coffee without being asked, his hand brushing hers when he passed her documents, the way he started asking about her day, her thoughts, her opinions on things that had nothing to do with work. Then came the night of the charity gala. One of Dante's foundations was hosting a benefit for underprivileged youth, and attendance was mandatory for all senior staff. Naomi had assumed she would blend into the background, handling logistics and putting out fires, but Dante had other ideas. "You will be my guest," he informed her, leaving no room for argument. "I need someone I can trust at my side, and you are the most trustworthy person I know." Naomi wanted to protest. She had nothing appropriate to wear. She didn't know how to navigate high society events. She would embarrass him. But Dante overrode every objection with his characteristic efficiency. A stylist arrived with dresses. A hairdresser appeared to work magic with her natural curls. By the time the evening arrived, Naomi barely recognized herself. The dress was emerald green, setting off her dark skin, beautifully. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant updo that showed off her neck and shoulders. She looked, for the first time in her life, like someone who belonged in places like this. Dante's reaction when she emerged from the guest suite made every moment of uncomfortable preparation worthwhile. He simply stopped whatever he'd been about to say dying on his lips and stared at her with an expression that made her heart stutter. "Miss Carter," he said finally, his voice rough in a way she'd never heard before. "You are stunning." "Thank you." She managed to keep her voice steady, but just barely. "You look nice, too." It was the understatement of the century. In his custom tuxedo, Dante Moretti looked like he had stepped out of a film about devastatingly handsome criminals, which Naomi supposed he essentially was. The gala itself was overwhelming, a sea of wealthy donors and politicians and celebrities, all competing to be seen and to curry favor with their host. Dante navigated it with practiced ease, but he kept Naomi close the entire evening, his hand on the small of her back as they moved through the crowd. People noticed. Of course they noticed. Whispers followed them everywhere they went. Who is she? Where did she come from? Is she the new... Naomi tried to ignore them, but Dante addressed it directly. "They are wondering if you are my latest mistress," he murmured in her ear as they stood by the bar, watching the dance floor fill. "And what should I tell them if they ask?" "Tell them nothing. Let them wonder." He turned to look at her, his eyes dark and serious. "Unless you would prefer to clarify the nature of our relationship?" Naomi's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "And what is the nature of our relationship?" Dante was silent for a long moment. Then he set down his glass and extended his hand. "Dance with me," he said. It was not a question. Naomi took his hand. Dancing with Dante was nothing like the few awkward experiences Naomi had had at college parties and office functions. He moved with the same controlled grace he brought to everything, leading her effortlessly through the steps of a waltz she had never learned but somehow found herself knowing in his arms. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply moved together, bodies closer than was strictly professional, breath mingling in the space between them. Finally, Dante spoke. "I have tried," he said quietly, for his ears alone, to maintain appropriate boundaries with you. You came to me vulnerable and desperate, and taking advantage of that would have been beneath me. But I find myself struggling. Struggling? To remember that you are my employee, To remember that I should not want what I want. His hand tightened on her waist. To remember that you deserve someone without the shadows I carry. Naomi looked up at him, this complicated, dangerous, unexpectedly kind man who had pulled her out of an alley and given her back her life. Maybe, she said softly, I should get to decide what I deserve. Dante's eyes searched hers. And what do you want, Naomi? What do you actually want? It was the first time he had used her first name. Something about it broke through the last of her reservations. You, she said simply. I want you. The kiss was inevitable after that. Not there, on the dance floor in front of 500 guests, but later, in the elevator up to his penthouse, his mouth claiming hers with a passion that felt like it had been building since the moment he'd seen her through that window. He kissed her like she was precious, like she was powerful, like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. Tell me to stop, he murmured against her lips, and I will. But I need to hear you say it. Don't stop, Naomi whispered back. Please don't ever stop. Dante pulled back just far enough to look into her eyes. What happened to not mixing business with pleasure? Maybe I'm willing to risk it. For you. For this. This, he said, his voice rough with emotion, is everything. You are everything. I have tried to fight it, but you have become more important to me than anything in my world. And that terrifies me. Why? Because people I care about tend to become targets. I have enemies, Naomi, real ones. If they knew how much you mattered to me, then we'll be careful. We'll be smart. But I'm not going to pretend I don't feel this because it's inconvenient. Life is too short and too uncertain, and I have spent too much time already being afraid. Dante stared at her for a long moment, then something shifted in his expression. A wall crumbling, a door opening. Then we do this together, he said. Whatever comes, whatever enemies, whatever challenges, we face them as one. Together, Naomi agreed. The elevator doors opened onto his penthouse, and Dante lifted her in his arms with an ease that made her gasp. Tonight, he said, I am going to show you exactly what you mean to me. And he did. Their relationship changed everything and nothing. Naomi still did her job with the same competence and dedication, but now there were stolen kisses in the office and nights spent in Dante's bed and mornings where she woke to find him watching her with an expression of wonder that made her heart ache. The first time they made love, it was nothing like Naomi had expected. She had anticipated intensity, passion, perhaps even roughness from a man whose life was defined by power and control. Instead, Dante had been almost reverent, gentle, patient. He had taken his time learning her body, discovering what made her gasp and shiver and cry out, and when they finally came together, it felt less like physical pleasure and more like coming home. Afterward, lying tangled in his sheets while the city lights painted patterns on the ceiling, Dante had traced patterns on her bare shoulder and spoken in a voice roughened by emotion. I have been with other women, he said quietly. Many of them. It means nothing to lie about that. But this, what we just did, I have never felt that before. Like I was giving you not just my body, but something else. Something I did not even know I had left to give. Naomi had turned to face him, studying the vulnerability in his usually guarded eyes. What do you think you gave me? Everything? He smiled, but it was fragile around the edges. Every defense I have built, every wall I have constructed. You have slipped past all of them, Naomi. You are inside now. And I find that I do not want you to leave. I am not going anywhere, she promised. Not unless you send me away. Then you will be here forever. Because I will never send you away. I could not. Not now. Not after this. They learned each other in the weeks that followed. Naomi discovered that Dante was ticklish on his sides, a fact that delighted her endlessly and that he pretended to hate but secretly loved. She learned that he talked in his sleep, mostly in Italian, and that he had nightmares sometimes that made him thrash and cry out. When those happened, she would hold him until he calmed, stroking his hair and murmuring reassurances until the darkness passed. He learned her too, learned that she loved gospel music and would sing in the shower when she thought no one was listening, learned that she had a sweet tooth that bordered on addiction and that she could devour an entire pan of Giovanni's tiramisu if left unsupervised, learned that she cried at commercials sometimes, the ones about sick children or lonely animals, and that she was embarrassed by her own softness, even though he found it beautiful. They were careful as they had promised. In public, they maintained professional distance. Only Marco and Rosa knew the truth, and both had simply nodded as if they had been expecting it all along. But the criminal underworld has eyes everywhere, and secrets never stay buried forever. It was 3 months after the gala when the trouble started. Naomi was working late, reviewing contracts for a new real estate acquisition, when Marco appeared at her office door with an expression that made her blood run cold. "We need to move you," he said without preamble. "Now." "What's happening?" "Someone's been asking questions about you. The wrong kind of someone." "Marco, tell me what's going on." "There's a rival family, the Ricci's, who have been looking for leverage against the boss. They figured out that you're not just his assistant, and they've made threats." Fear shot through Naomi, but underneath it was something else, a fierce determination that surprised her. "Where's Dante?" "Handling it." "But he wants you safe. There's a car waiting downstairs to take you to a secure location." "I'm not running," Naomi heard herself say. "If they want to use me against him, running won't change that, and I refuse to let these people think they can control us with threats." Marco looked at her with something like respect. "The boss said you'd say that. He also said to tell you that he needs you safe, so he can focus on dealing with the problem without distraction. Please, Miss Carter, for him." Naomi hesitated, torn between her desire to stand her ground and her understanding that Dante couldn't function if he was worried about her. "Fine," she said finally, "but I want updates. I'm not going to sit in some safe house not knowing what's happening." "Deal." The safe house was the apartment in Brooklyn that Naomi would never have guessed belonged to anyone, let alone a mafia family. It was comfortable but not luxurious, anonymous in a way that suggested careful planning. Rosa had accompanied her, along with 2 guards whose names Naomi had never learned, but whose presence was oddly reassuring. They sat up in the small living room making tea and trying to pretend that everything was normal. "I remember when I first came to work for Mr. Moretti," Rosa said, her hands wrapped around her mug. "I was terrified. Not of him? Well, maybe a little of him, but of everything his world represented. The danger, the uncertainty, the knowledge that at any moment something could go wrong." "What made you stay?" Rosa smiled, her expression softening with memory. "He saved my life. Not metaphorically, like giving me a job, although he did that too. Actually saved my life. My ex-husband had found me. He had a gun. Mr. Moretti happened to be in the wrong place at the right time, and he handled the situation. Afterward, he offered me a job, a home, protection. He asked nothing in return except loyalty and hard work. It was the first time anyone had ever offered me something without expecting payment." Naomi nodded slowly, understanding more deeply now why Dante inspired such devotion in his people. "He collects the broken ones," Rosa continued, "not to exploit them. I have seen men who do that, and he is not one of them. He collects them because he sees something in them worth saving, worth nurturing. He gives people chances when no one else will." "Why do you think he does it?" Rosa considered the question. "His mother, I think. The way he talks about her, she must have been remarkable. She taught him that power meant nothing if you did not use it to help others. That strength was only valuable if it protected the weak. He carries that lesson in everything he does, even when it would be easier not to." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Naomi tensed, her heart racing, but it was only Marco, looking exhausted but calm. "It is done," he said. "Mr. Moretti is on his way. He wanted me to tell you that you are safe now. The threat has been neutralized." Neutralized. Such a clinical word for what Naomi suspected had been a very unclinical process. She did not ask for details. She was not sure she wanted to know. Dante came to her that night, slipping through the door with exhaustion etched in every line of his face. "It's done," he said, pulling her into his arms without preamble. "The Ricci's have been persuaded to reconsider their approach." "Persuaded how?" Dante was quiet for a moment. "In ways you don't need to know about. The important thing is that you're safe, that they know better than to touch what's mine." There was a darkness in his voice that reminded Naomi of who she was dealing with. This man who held her so gently had done terrible things tonight, would do them again if necessary. "Does it bother you?" Dante asked, reading her expression. "Knowing what I am capable of?" Naomi considered the question honestly. A month ago, even a week ago, she might have given a different answer, but she had seen too much of this world now. She understood that violence existed whether you participated in it or not, and that sometimes the only way to protect what you loved was to fight for it. It bothers me that it was necessary, she said finally, but I know who you are, Dante. All of who you are, and I chose you anyway. Even the dark parts? Even those. Because you also pulled a starving woman out of an alley and gave her back her life. You also built foundations that helped thousands of people. You also love your mother's memory enough to honor it with kindness. The darkness is part of you, but it's not all of you. And I am not naive enough to think that the world runs on kindness alone. Dante looked at her with something like wonder. How did I find you? You didn't find me. I found your dumpster. You just happened to be watching. Best thing I ever watched for. He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. I love you, Naomi Carter. I know I have no right to, given everything I am and everything I've done. But I love you anyway. I love you too, she whispered against his lips. And for what it's worth, I think you have every right. Love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing. And I choose you, Dante Moretti. Today and every day after. They made love that night with a tenderness that took Naomi's breath away. Dante touched her like she was precious, worshipped her body like it was sacred, and when they finally fell asleep tangled together, Naomi felt a peace she had never known before. She had gone from eating out of a dumpster to being loved by one of the most powerful men in the city. It shouldn't have been possible. It shouldn't have been real. But it was. Against all odds, it was. The months that followed were not easy. Dante's world was complicated, and loving him meant accepting those complications. There were more threats, more nights when he came home tense and silent, more moments when Naomi had to remind herself that she had chosen this with full knowledge of what it entailed. But there were also more wonderful things than she had ever imagined. Sunday mornings in bed with coffee and newspapers, evenings spent cooking together in his massive kitchen, laughing when things went wrong. Trips to Italy to visit his ancestral home, where his extended family embraced her with warmth that brought tears to her eyes. And there was the night, exactly 1 year after he had pulled her out of that alley, when Dante got down on one knee in the middle of his restaurant, closed for a private event that turned out to be just for them, and asked her to be his wife. I know this isn't the life you imagined, he said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. I know I come with complications and dangers and a family history that would terrify any sensible person, but I also know that I have never loved anyone the way I love you, and I cannot imagine my future without you in it. So I'm asking you, Naomi Carter, will you take a chance on this imperfect man and build something beautiful with me? Naomi looked at him, this complicated, dangerous, unexpectedly kind man who had seen her at her lowest and lifted her up, who had believed in her when she had stopped believing in herself, who had given her not just a job and a home, but a purpose and a place in the world. Yes, she said, the word coming out through tears. 1,000 times, yes. The wedding was 6 months later, a small ceremony in the garden of the Italian villa where Dante's mother had been born, attended only by their closest friends and family. Naomi wore white, Dante wore a suit that made him look like something out of a fairy tale, and when they exchanged vows, there was not a dry eye in the audience. The morning of the wedding, Naomi had sat alone in the bridal suite, looking at herself in the mirror and trying to reconcile the woman she saw with the woman who had been digging through garbage just over a year ago. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, decorated with tiny white flowers that reminded her of the ones her grandmother used to grow on their fire escape. Her makeup was subtle but beautiful, enhancing features that she had always considered ordinary, but that Dante told her every day were extraordinary. Rosa knocked and entered, carrying something wrapped in velvet. Mr. Moretti asked me to give this to you, she said, setting the package on the vanity. He said his mother would have wanted you to have it. Naomi unwrapped the velvet carefully, her breath catching when she saw what lay inside. It was a necklace. Antique, obviously valuable, but more than that, obviously loved. The gold was worn smooth in places from decades of handling, and the small diamond pendant caught the light in ways that spoke of exceptional quality. It belonged to Teresa, Rosa explained softly. Mr. Moretti's mother. She wore it on her wedding day, and he has kept it all these years, waiting for the right person to give it to. Tears spilled down Naomi's cheeks, ruining the makeup that had taken an hour to apply. She did not care. Help me put it on? She asked Rosa, her voice thick with emotion. It would be my honor. When Naomi walked down the aisle, a simple path between chairs set up in the garden, lined with roses and candles, Dante's eyes went straight to the necklace. For a moment his composure cracked, and she saw the grief he still carried for his mother mixing with the joy of this moment. Then he smiled, that rare, genuine smile, and Naomi knew she had made the right choice. The ceremony itself was brief but beautiful. They had written their own vows, speaking promises to each other that felt too intimate for an audience, but that they shared anyway. "I was eating from a dumpster when you found me," Naomi said, laughing through her tears. "And now I'm standing in an Italian garden marrying the most wonderful man I have ever known. If that is not proof that life can surprise you, I do not know what is." Dante smiled that rare, genuine smile that he saved only for her. "You were not just eating from a dumpster. You were surviving. You were fighting. You were refusing to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. I just had the good sense to recognize how extraordinary that made you. So you are saying you fell in love with my survival instincts? I am saying I fell in love with everything about you. From the moment I saw you through that window, something in me knew that you were going to change my life. I just did not know how much." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Dante kissed her with a tenderness that made the audience sigh, and Naomi's knees go weak. "Ti amo, moglie mia," he whispered against her lips. "I love you, my wife." "Ti amo, marito mio," she whispered back, proud of the Italian she had been secretly learning. "I love you, my husband." The reception was a joyous affair. Giovanni prepared a feast that would have fed an army. Rosa organized the decorations with military precision. Marco gave a toast that made everyone cry, and when Dante pulled Naomi onto the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife, she felt like the luckiest woman in the world. "Do you ever think about that night?" he murmured in her ear as they swayed together. "What might have happened if I hadn't been at that window?" "All the time," Naomi admitted. "Sometimes it keeps me up at night thinking about how close I came to missing this. To missing you, but you didn't miss me. Because fate or God or whatever force governs this universe knew that we needed each other, that together we could be more than we ever were alone. You're getting philosophical in your old age. I'm getting reflective. Marriage does that to a man." Naomi laughed and pulled him closer. "I love you, Dante Moretti, even your philosophical moments." "And I love you, Naomi Moretti." He paused, tasting the name. "That sounds right, like it was always supposed to be that way." "Always," she agreed. "From dumpster to altar." "Best journey of my life," Dante said, and kissed her as the music swelled around them. 5 years later, Naomi Moretti stood at the window of their new home, a brownstone in Brooklyn that Dante had purchased because Naomi wanted their children to grow up in a real neighborhood, not a penthouse, watching her husband play in the backyard with their twin daughters. Isabella and Lucia, named for grandmothers they would never meet but would always hear stories about, were 3 years old and had their father completely wrapped around their tiny fingers. Dante Moretti, feared by rivals and respected by allies, could be brought to his knees by a single pout from either of his daughters. It was, Naomi thought, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. A lot had changed in the years since that night in the alley. Dante had gradually transitioned more of his family's operations into legitimate business, driven partly by Naomi's influence and partly by his own desire to give his daughters a legacy they could be proud of. There were still shadows in their world. There always would be. But they were smaller now, more manageable. Naomi herself had grown from assistant to partner, taking over management of several of the Moretti family foundations and turning them into nationally recognized organizations. Her work with homeless services in particular had won awards and attention, driven by her own experience of what it felt like to have nowhere to go. She never forgot where she came from. She'd never let herself forget. On the first anniversary of the night they met, Naomi surprised Dante with a gift. She had arranged for a private dinner at La Stella Nera, in the same private dining room where he had first fed her, and she had asked Giovanni to prepare the exact same meal. The pasta with sausage, the fresh bread, the chicken soup that had tasted like salvation. "What is this?" Dante asked, looking at the familiar dishes with confusion. "A reminder," Naomi said, "of where we started, of what you gave me when I had nothing. I never want us to forget that night." Dante's eyes softened. "I could never forget it. It was the night I found my future." They ate slowly, reminiscing about those first awkward conversations, laughing about Naomi's suspicion and Dante's awkward attempts at charity. It felt like a lifetime ago, and in many ways it was. They were different people now. Stronger, happier, more whole. After dinner, Dante took her hand and led her to the window of his office, the same window from which he had first seen her. "I stand here sometimes," he confessed, "when the work is overwhelming or the world feels too dark. I stand here and remember the moment I looked down and saw you. I remember thinking that you were the most dignified person I had ever seen, even though you were doing something most people would find shameful, and I remember knowing with absolute certainty that I was supposed to help you." "Do you believe in fate?" Naomi asked. "I did not, before you. But now?" Dante shook his head slowly. "How else do you explain it? 1,000 things had to happen exactly right for you to be in that alley at that exact moment when I happened to be at this window. If any single variable had been different, if you had chosen a different restaurant, if I had stayed home that night, if my previous assistant had not gotten married and moved away, we never would have met. It seems impossible that all of that was coincidence." "Maybe it was not coincidence," Naomi said softly. "Maybe it was grace." Grace. Dante tested the word. "I like that. It feels accurate. You are my grace, Naomi. The unexpected gift I never knew I needed." Every year on that anniversary, they returned to the restaurant. Every year they ate the same meal and stood at the same window and remembered. It became their tradition, their ritual, their way of honoring the improbable miracle that had brought them together. And every year, Naomi looked down at that alley and sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the night she had been desperate enough to steal from a dumpster and brave enough to accept help when it was offered. "Mama!" Lucia called from the garden, waving enthusiastically. "Daddy says we can have ice cream." Naomi raised an eyebrow at her husband, who gave her his most innocent expression. "Daddy says a lot of things," Naomi called back. "Tell him ice cream is after dinner, not before." Isabella's face crumpled in disappointment, but Dante scooped her up and whispered something that made her giggle, and the crisis was averted. He always knew what to say. He always knew how to fix things. It was one of the many reasons Naomi loved him. That evening, after the girls were in bed and the house was quiet, Dante found Naomi in the kitchen, washing dishes and looking out at the garden where their daughters had played. "You're thinking deep thoughts," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I'm thinking about how different my life is from what I expected. How much better it is." "Better than a dumpster?" he teased gently. "Better than anything I ever imagined. Even before the dumpster, even when I had a job and an apartment and a plan, I never imagined feeling this complete, this happy." Dante pressed a kiss to her neck. "You deserve all of it. Every moment of happiness. Every bit of love. You deserve it more than anyone I've ever known." Naomi turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had changed everything. "You know what I think about sometimes?" "Tell me." "I think about the woman I was that night, cold and hungry and desperate, picking through garbage because I had run out of options. And I think about what I would tell her if I could go back." "What would you tell her?" "That help comes from unexpected places. That one moment can change everything. And that sometimes the person who saves you is the last person you would ever expect." She smiled, touching his face. "I would tell her to take the coat, take the job, take the chance, because on the other side of fear is everything she ever wanted." Dante's eyes were bright with emotion. "I love you, Naomi, more than I have words to express." "I know. I love you too. Always have. Always will." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, just like the first time. And Naomi Carter Moretti, former homeless woman, turned foundation director, turned wife and mother, kissed him back, because love, she had learned, wasn't about where you started. It was about where you ended up. And she had ended up exactly where she belonged. In his arms, in his life, in his heart, forever. That's the story of Naomi Carter, the woman who stole food from a dumpster and caught the attention of an Italian mafia boss who was watching from his window. Her story proves that rock bottom isn't the end. Sometimes it's just the beginning. It proves that kindness from strangers can change lives, that love can grow in the most unlikely circumstances, and that everyone deserves a second chance. Naomi's journey reminds us that dignity isn't about what you have. It's about how you carry yourself when you have nothing. And it reminds us that sometimes the person who seems most dangerous is exactly the one who will protect you with everything they have. If this story touched your heart and you want to hear more tales of unexpected love, dangerous protection, and second chances, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We share new stories every week about people who discovered that fate works in mysterious ways and that the most meaningful connections often come from the most unlikely moments. What did you think of Naomi and Dante's story? Have you ever experienced kindness from an unexpected source that changed your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how these stories resonate with your own experiences. Remember, sometimes you have to fall all the way down before you can rise higher than you ever imagined. And sometimes the window that looks out on your lowest moment is the same window through which your destiny is watching. Thanks for listening, and we will see you in the next story.